Great, thanks, Aoife. So, so the schedule for today is just that we're going to do a little bit of an introduction to the Creative Europe desk. So what myself and Aoife do, and then we're going to talk about fair remuneration and paying the artists with Keith Thompson, who's our colleague at the Arts Council, and then we're going to have time for questions. And yeah, they won't be recorded. So yeah, do feel free to put your mic on and say something if you'd like, or you can pop it into the chat as it comes up, and we can just read them after. So yeah, just a little bit about the Creative Europe desk. So we have 3 offices. We have 2 in Dublin, one being the culture one, which is myself and Aoife, and then there's the media office in Dublin, and then there's the media office as well in Galway. Yeah, so what we do as the culture office is we provide information, advice and assistance to Irish applicants to Creative Europe programmes. And we promote the programme at a local, regional and national level. We collaborate with key sectorial stakeholders and agencies. We also collaborate with the wider Creative Europe Desk network, so in different countries, and we also assist with partner searches. So that also is often in collaboration with the wider European sort of desk network. And then we have cross-sectorial partnerships and events with the media office as well. And then why the EU funds culture? So obviously there's that sort of intrinsic value to society and the economic value as well. And then there's treaty commitments, long-standing treaty commitments. But then there's also kind of like broader EU policy, which informs why the EU funds culture, but then also how they fund it. So there's a few of them there that are sort of like good background to be aware of. Yeah, so, and then how that funding is distributed. So there's direct funding actions like the European Capitals of Culture. There's also prizes like popular music, contemporary architecture, contemporary literature, cultural heritage. And then there's centrally administered funding program, which is Creative Europe, which is the current program that we're in right now, so 2021 to 2027. And that's across the culture, media, and then cross-sector as well. And this is the breakdown then of the sort of that budget. So it's 2.44 billion, and that's the distribution there. And then the kind of overall culture priorities are resilience and recovery, innovation and joint creation, cooperation and exchange of practices, key players and multipliers, and then capacity building of artists. And then I'm just going to talk very briefly about what a cooperation project is, and then we'll kind of lead on to why the focus is on this particular topic today. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware of cooperation projects, but just a reminder or context for anyone that doesn't know. So they're multi-annual cultural or artistic projects, and they also involve partnerships between organizations in different countries. The amount of partnerships depends on the scale. And then it also achieves common objectives across borders, and it requires match funding, and it's for organizations rather than individuals. But artists participate in cooperation projects via organizations, so that's quite important to what we're going to be talking about today. And then it also supports diverse partnerships and funds a broad range of activities. And then just kind of like looking at the question with this is in Form B of the cooperation projects. So this has actually changed from last year, and it's kind of put more of a focus on remuneration and working conditions. I think last year it was more sort of EDI, and then you could talk about fair remuneration as part of it, but this year they're kind of explicitly saying it. So that's kind of why we thought it would be really good to have a talk about it today, and he's got some really valuable expertise on that. So I'm going to hand over to him now. Let me just stop sharing, sorry.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'll bring my slides up now. Just check that we can we see that? Is that coming up for you?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, well, yeah, thank you, Lucy, Leona, Aoife, thank you very much for having me. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be here today to chat with you about fair remuneration and working conditions for artists and cultural professionals, especially as this relates to your applications for the European cooperation projects. My name is Keith Thompson. I am the policy officer at the Arts Council, so I work primarily on the implementation of our Paying the Artist policy. Um, So this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about that policy, paying the artist. But to begin, I'd really like to talk more broadly about the issues with regard to pay and working conditions in the arts that the policy seeks to address. And also then share some ideas or approaches that you might consider within your projects to be a leader, I suppose, in addressing and improving artists' pay and conditions. Finally, as well, I'll share a few kind of final considerations and references. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, will have direct lived experience of the financial challenges of being an artist. So I do apologize if I'm treading over familiar ground here, but I feel it's useful to start by reminding us of some of the numerous and interlinked causes or drivers of low pay and precarious working conditions. And some of the main issues that artists face are, of course, low rates of pay, not being valued enough for the work that they do, but also a lack of access to different work opportunities. There's not enough work going around sometimes. Artists often incur high variable costs of creation, such as studio rental, material costs, transport, and often at the beginning of projects when they haven't received any payment. There is quite often an expectation for artists to deliver additional unpaid hours on a project, but also artists are quite often willing to do unpaid hours due to their passion to get work done. And generally, artists face the general financial instability and weak negotiating position that come with self-employment. We know very well that there's a limited amount of funding that can be applied for. And artists will also face a lack of control over their intellectual property and an inability sometimes to continue to make money from the exploitation of their work. And that is made increasingly more threatened by AI these days. Now, we have recent research in Ireland from the Department of Culture and the Arts that has given us some clear figures on this. So this is specific to Ireland, but many of the much of the data here would have similar stories across Europe. So surveying 3,000 artists and arts workers through the second half of 2023, this research found that almost 1/3 of artists took on unpaid work. Only 22.5% reported being able to sustain themselves through arts work alone, so only just over a fifth. 79% of artists were predominantly self-employed. They may have taken up some PAYE employment in this time, but they were predominantly self-employed. 43% felt they were not able to negotiate a good price for their work, so they were accepting less than they thought they were worth. And just 22% were either very or somewhat dissatisfied with their working conditions. So there are challenges here for all artists, but I also want to look a little bit more specifically at there are significant disparities within that. And I draw your attention to this because, as Lucy mentioned there, one of the overarching priorities of the cooperation projects is gender equality and social inclusion. And one of the best ways we can promote inclusion and equality is by making arts careers viable and attractive. So, for instance, in Ireland, there is a greater prevalence of self-employment and unpaid work, and thus a greater vulnerability and instability for those who identify as neither male nor female. Men are more likely to report being able to sustain themselves through arts work alone than either women or those whose gender was other than male or female. And dissatisfaction with working conditions is 40% higher for women than for men, and 44% higher for those whose gender was other than male or female. So there are significant disparities here. But these gender disparities are also amplified where they intersect with other factors such as disability or ethnicity. So, for instance, in Ireland, all the preceding insecurities and challenges are more acute for artists with disabilities, who also face the imposition of earning thresholds attached to disability welfare supports. They face financial and physical barriers to access, such as access to venues, to transport, to funding application processes. And also face a stigma regarding both their capabilities and value. So these are some of the challenges which the Paying the Artist policy seeks to address. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. So this is our policy on the fair and equitable remuneration and contracting of artists. It sets out our vision for an arts sector in Ireland where artists are able to make work of ambition and quality and be remunerated appropriately. We want artists to have productive and rewarding careers. We also want to end that culture of artists being underpaid or unpaid, or being asked to work for exposure. And we want individual artists to feel empowered to expect better, to better conditions and terms and better pay whenever they are hired or commissioned. And all of those goals need to be met if we want to achieve a truly diverse arts ecology. If we want to attract people to become artists and work in the arts from all walks of life with different ideas and approaches, careers need to be both sustainable and viable. And if only those that have other means or other forms of support can work in the arts, then we limit the voices that are heard and the quality of art. So how does Paying the Artist as a policy go about trying to achieve this vision? Well, there are a number of different elements to it, but for now, for our purposes today, I'd just briefly like to highlight two of them. The first is our implementation plan, which outlines a set of actions we have committed to in order to advance fair pay and working conditions. So these actions include undertaking research, conducting a review of the pay policies of our strategically funded organizations, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that later. Monitoring and analyzing trends in artists' pay in the projects and the companies that we fund, and pursuing advocacy to promote the aims of the policy, such as this very presentation. Now, the second element of that policy I'd really like to highlight is our list of best practice principles. So it's a list of standards that we adhere to when contracting artists. And we want to see these applied to all professional engagements in the arts. The principles are at a high level, but they're generally applicable across all arts areas. And they include, but are not limited to these that you see on the screen. So, being transparent about the ask and the offer, what you're asking an artist to do and what you're offering them for it. Complying with rates which are recommended by representative organizations, or even going further and improving upon those rates if possible. Providing written contracts that include the full scope of any engagement, so there are no kind of subsequent asks of the artist without further pay. Providing clarity on when payments will be made and differentiating between pay and expenses for transport or materials and things like that. A really important one is ring fencing fees for creatives in project budgets. So making sure that that money that is earmarked for artists stays there and is given wholly to the artists. And overall, kind of providing fair terms and an opportunity for artists to negotiate their fees. So those are two main elements of the policy that we're using to try and achieve this vision of a better arts ecology. But perhaps I think the most important aspect that I want to draw your attention to today about the Paying the Artist policy is that it's not yours. It is very much our policy. And it outlines how we want to act and engage with others in the sector. And of course, we want organizations to act with the same principles, but how those work in practice will be and should be different for each organization. So if the organization that you work for, that you represent, it doesn't have a pay policy, we would certainly encourage you to look at paying the artist, especially those best practice principles. But it's essential to really think about how issues with regard to pay and working conditions specifically manifest themselves for the artists that you employ, or that you work with, so that when you're developing your policy or your approach, you can really think about the things that you can put into practice to address those causes of low pay and poor working conditions. So what might you include in developing your approach to fair remuneration, I suppose specifically for the cooperation projects? As Lucy showed you earlier there in your application, you're asked to explain how the project will ensure the fair remuneration and working conditions of the artists and cultural professionals involved. Now, as far as I can see, this is not asking you to provide a fully fleshed out policy, more of a statement or an approach. And there may be some here on the call who already have a policy or have an established approach to how they pay artists. So it may be easy to just copy and paste that across into the application. But this may be an opportunity to experiment with different practices and different approaches. So over the next few slides, I'll talk you through some useful elements you might consider including, as well as examples of best practice in artist pay policies that we've seen, and certain things that you might wish to avoid. And much of this info has emerged from a project that we're currently undertaking to analyze the pay policies of some of our strategically funded organizations. So I'll start by just telling you a little bit more about that project. So this has involved reviewing the pay policies of 92 of our strategically funded organizations. It's been conducted by independent consultants and has three main outputs. So the first output is it was a research overview which analyzed the drivers or the causes of low pay and poor working conditions, which I talked through at the beginning of the presentation. The next output was a series of consultations with strategically funded organizations, also with resource organizations and representative organizations. And we just conducted those at the end of January. And I believe that there may be some representatives from strategically funded organizations on the call. So apologies if there's a bit of repetition here. That next stage of the consultations also includes an artist survey, which is available, open for responses until the 17th of February. And the final aspect of that is what that project is really leading towards is a toolkit or some set of resources to help organizations create a policy where one doesn't exist, or develop an existing policy on artists' pay. And if anyone was on the call last week, Hannah took you through the EDI policy toolkit, and that is, we're looking to develop something similar, but we're not quite there yet. We anticipate it being kind of finished by the summertime this year. But in the absence of that resource, I think I can share some useful things, as I said, to avoid, and some examples of best practice. So first of all, just looking at the features of an effective policy, kind of widely accepted that there are 8 main features in an effective policy. I'm providing them here as reference for you. I know the slides will be sent out afterwards, because not all of these will be needed in your application. Not all of these will be specifically relevant. But I think any approach to artist pay and working conditions should at the very least detail the principles underlying it, the practices that you have chosen to fulfill or meet those principles, and a goal or a desired outcome that you're trying to achieve. How are you looking to improve pay and conditions for artists? So, as I said, there are a few things I would recommend avoiding if possible. And I suppose some of these are more relevant to Irish organizations. One is relying too much on the paying the artist policy, relying too much on other guidelines that are out there, because it's really important to think about how to put into practice things that are specific to your engagements with artists. So do read and learn what you can, but really make sure you're thinking what is specific to you. Another thing to avoid is focusing only on or primarily on pay. And obviously paying artists more is great, but there are many different aspects of working conditions that can be tackled as well, like I talked through earlier on. It's one thing to state what you currently do, what your current practice is, which is great, but it's a different thing altogether to think about what you can do and what changes you would like to see that you could bring about through your policy or your approach. And finally, then it's important not to ignore the causes of low pay and poor working conditions. So this is, as I said, a lot of this is emerging from that research project into the pay policies of our strategically funded organizations. From that research, we have a huge number of examples of really good practice that those organizations are currently using or availing of. And these really tackle or address those causes of low pay and poor working conditions. So to address low rates of pay, you could consider offering a cancellation policy, which would give artists some financial protection if their work is cancelled. You could seek to match or improve on pay rates set by representative organizations, or could look to increase pay rates in line with inflation. In dealing with intellectual property, you could provide additional fees for artists when sharing recorded performances of their work so that they continue to benefit from the continued exploitation of that work. To address their weak negotiating position, it's incredibly valuable to support artists to negotiate, to encourage them to value their own work and advise them on how to engage in conversations with potential employers, even if that means yourselves. And some of the best examples and best practices we found came from policies where organizations had really done in-depth consultations with their artists. A massive thing you could do, and I mentioned this earlier because it's in the Paying the Artist policy, is ring fencing artist fees in budgets, so that if there are overruns in your budget for other reasons, you don't make this up by taking those wages, that salary from the artists themselves. To tackle the high variable costs, especially if you work, say, with visual artists or artists that use a lot of materials, you could set up an account with a supplier so they're not forced to rely on their own funds to experiment and create, especially at the beginning of projects when they haven't received any payment. Or in dealing with access to work opportunities, you could offer a flexible approach to scheduling so that artists can take up other work even while they're working with you, especially for artists who have portfolio careers. If you are in an organization where you have a salaried position and you have meetings with artists, they are quite likely the only one at the table who isn't getting paid for their time. So it can be an idea to offer to pay artists for meetings and engagements like that. And similarly, if offering a flat fee for a project, it's really valuable to calculate that fee based on expected hours so that both you and the people you're hiring know what's expected and what that's worth. And really importantly for artists in tackling financial instability is when they get paid. And quite often they're waiting weeks or a month or two to receive payment for a project. So an idea could be to break up the fee, to offer part of it in advance, part of it during the project, and part of it afterwards, so they have some stability during that time. And all of these things, they're small things in some ways, and they can be applied whether you're part of a large organization or a small organization, or how much funding you've received. But they can make a massive difference to individual artists and alleviate some of those elements of low pay and poor working conditions. So while those are all specific examples of practices you could consider in your approaches, I'd really just like to kind of hammer home 3 key points. And first is that listening is really key. Knowing what would help the artists you work with is really essential. as I've said a few times, pay isn't everything. Obviously, we want to encourage higher rates of pay for artists, but there's a lot more that can be done around that, around when and how payments are made, and other supports that can be offered to alleviate those issues. And as I said previously, in your approach, you can state what you currently do, or you can maybe think about what more could we do, or how can we affect the change that we want to see for the artists that we work with. And you can have a really substantial impact, irrespective of the size of your organization or the amount of funding that you receive. So that's the main part of the presentation. The last few slides, I'll just quickly highlight a few final considerations and offer a few references that may be of use as well. So the first thing to know is that adequate pay and working conditions, play a big part, as I mentioned earlier, in developing and improving gender equality and social inclusion, making arts work sustainable and viable. So that this is one of the overarching priorities of the cooperation projects, that first one there. And there's also a huge amount of work to be done within the third priority, digital transition, regarding copyright and intellectual property, ensuring that artists are getting a fair deal regarding the rights to their work. So this element of fair remuneration and working conditions really ties in with especially those overarching priorities. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on this, but just to draw your attention to the fact that there is a growing momentum on this topic at EU level. In 2023, the Open Method of Communication (OMC) Working Group delivered a report on the status of artists with several recommendations for policymakers in the EU. Since then, the European Parliament has used its own legislative initiative, and kind of brought to the Commission. They've been going back and forth discussing ways to bring some legislation or other policy actions forward on this. That's still ongoing. In the second half of 2026, Ireland will host the presidency of the EU, and us in the Arts Council, we definitely want to make sure that the status and financial and working situation of artists is on the agenda for that programme. And there are various EU directives either in place, the two that are mentioned there, minimum wage and collective bargaining, and copyright in the digital single market. They're both in place now, but we're kind of still seeing the working out of them in national contexts. But these have significant potential to affect conditions in the sector. So there's a lot of change going on and momentum going on this topic at EU level. And then finally, I'll leave you with a few useful references. There's links there to our Paying the Artist policy, our statement of practice, which is what we say, what we pay, how much we pay for specific engagements. The Netherlands Fair Practice Code is a brilliant piece of work that organizations, artists, and kind of institutions can sign up to in order to improve and develop fair practice across all areas of contracting and engagement in the arts. There are two research projects there, the Pantea Creative Pulse research, which is Europe-wide, and the one that I referenced earlier, the Arts Work Conditions and Perspectives, which is specific to Ireland. And finally, the OMC report, which again has a lot of very useful research in it, but also recommendations for further action in the area. So as we mentioned earlier, those slides will be distributed at the end, and if any of those references are useful, that's great. So thank you all again for listening. I hope I've been able to offer some